Bihar comes and says that I don't have money to do my things, right? But the point is, apne paon pe kuladi mari hai na. So how much of that should then be made up by the government of India?
Whenever we think about policy or politics, all eyes focus on Delhi. But you start from the beginning, by breaking down the Indian budget, that while central government does a lot of tax collection, the tax is redistributed to states, all managed by state governments.
At some level, the basic logic of debt at the government level is not that different from the household level. We have a rule of thumb that says don't borrow, okay? But there are times when borrowing makes sense. Every year when you have inflation, that is eroding the value of your money. The problem with just the printing money solution, the goods and services in the economy are the same. So if I'm just giving more money, then everybody's just going to bid it up and you're going to get inflation. So that doesn't solve the problem, right? There's this idea of a social safety net. Okay, but the problem with the net metaphor is you fall in the net and you stay trapped in the net. So the president of Singapore, he says we need social safety trampolines and not social safety nets. That when you fall, we will catch you, but we'll design systems that help you bounce back.
Karthik, welcome to episode 2. Yesterday, it was great to kind of, go through your book. And I think we covered, at a macro level, what does accelerating India's development mean? And what brought you to that point and thinking about where we are in the country's evolution, what are the opportunities, what is the current state. It was a great discussion. And, I learned so much and so many deep insights about what's happening with Indian economy. And one of the things we briefly touched upon yesterday is the role of state. And for me, that's a profoundly eye-opening idea because whenever we think about policy or politics, all eyes focus on Delhi. Ki, central government kya kar raha hai, what are the policies, what are big things, whether it's a GST or other things, they get a lot of attention. But you start from the beginning, by breaking down the Indian budget, that while central government does a lot of tax collection, the tax is redistributed to states. And something like over 60-65% is spent by state. Most of the government employees, they work for state governments, not for central government. Majority of services, especially the one that affect our everyday life from health, education, police, etc., all managed by state governments. And so that's, I think, we should definitely spend a lot of time on that. But let's start with, why don't you just break it down, this whole, from revenue standpoint, what happens in the collection, expenditure, distribution, and why you think states are, very important in that.
Correct. So I think, even before we do that, I think it's useful to take a step back, right? And think about how country size affects the quality of governance and the quality of citizens' lives. Okay. So, and there's a very, interesting question, right? Suppose I were to ask you a hypothetical question that if you were to be reborn in a completely random country, okay, would you prefer to be in a large country or a small country? Okay. So, any instincts on that?
Since I've read your book, I know the answer, so it's going to be cheating. But I know where you're going with this, right? And
I think, but this is something we don't think about much, right? And so the basic point is that there are trade-offs, as with everything, right? So there are many, many advantages of size, okay? And so historically, one of the biggest advantages of size was it gave you economies of scale in defense, okay? Because that was the biggest public good. And it gives you economies of scale in creating, internal markets, right? Larger markets, which is partly why we did GST. And so it's a good, I'll keep that in mind when we come back to that discussion. But, it gives you economies of scale in foreign affairs, in defense, in building certain kind of industries with high fixed costs. It also allows you to do spatial insurance, right? So there's come natural disaster somewhere, then you can compensate with tax money from somewhere else. People in disaster-stricken areas can move around. So in many, many ways, like being big is kind of has a lot of advantages. But it also comes with two major costs, right? And the first major cost of being big is that as you get bigger and bigger, there is more and more diversity to accommodate. So if you have to accommodate that diversity with a single policy, then it becomes kind of very difficult to please everybody.
And maybe let's put that in perspective, Karthik. Sorry to interrupt, but I think you mentioned in the book that many of Indian states are among, if they were independent country, they're among top 10 or top 20 countries in the world.
Exactly. Which is, again, mind-boggling, right? And so And so, so anyway, so I'll do this quickly because easily we can get into a deeper first principles of federalism. But, so I think the point is the two major costs of size, correct? So one is you have to accommodate diversity. The second is the bigger you are, the distance between the citizen and the government kind of increases, right? And so it becomes very difficult for a government to be responsive, okay, to citizens' needs and acting on local information, right? So the two big costs of size are uniformity and kind of responsiveness, okay? So the institution of federalism is kind of a very kind of creative device that is designed to help us get the best of both worlds. That saying, there are some functions for which being big is good. Okay, so those functions should sit at the level of a national government. And there are other functions for which being small is good because, and states are this interesting intermediary, and particularly in India, right? States have been incredibly important, I would argue, for the preservation of Indian unity itself, right? Because at the time of independence, one of the biggest concerns was that, how is this country going to stay together? There is literally so little common between, say, the Punjabi and the Malayali and kind of, somebody in Assam. And a lot of experts felt that the country wouldn't hold. Okay, they had just come through partition. Okay, and so and just to get a sense, India has the diversity in India is kind of unimaginable, right? So we have more people in India than the entire Western hemisphere put together, more than North America, Central America, South America, right? So it just, look at the map. It's just that entire Western hemisphere, okay? India has more people than that. Yeah. Till recently, we had more people than all of Africa, which is 54 countries and 10 times bigger in terms of size, okay? So that diversity is just, it's mind-boggling. Okay. And so
just to maybe, that's very interesting fact, right? If we visualize entire North America, which is Canada, which is a massive country, US, you have Mexico, and there's so many big countries, South America, which is Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and so on. You put all that together, I think my understanding is only about 1.1 billion, something like that.
Exactly.
We are much bigger in a much, much smaller land. So it is, vast population and relatively smaller land size.
Exactly. Right, of course. And, a lot of this just has to do with kind of the river valleys, right? Because that's what gives you the fertile soil that gives you kind of these big populations. But the point is, therefore, coming back to governing India, right? So the political project of modern India itself is a miracle. And so, but coming back to therefore federalism and state, right? Is that states in India have been incredibly important because they're not just administrative units, but they're also kind of linguistic and cultural units, right? And so, and there was a strong disagreement among even the founders, right? So people like Nehru and Ambedkar were worried about linguistic states, and people like Gandhiji were actually in favor because, Gandhiji always put society ahead of state, right? And he said, this is the structure of society, and this makes sense. So I think, but the long story short, I think most experts now, when you go back and analyze India, think that the linguistic states was one of the best things we did because it allowed kind of a unity and diversity where and Ram Goa now says this, right? You can be just as kind of staunch a Kannadigan as an Indian, and you keep your local identity and you're kind of, part of this whole. So the point, therefore, is that the states become so coming back to first principles of federalism, right? So the functions that need to respect diversity are better done at lower levels of government. The functions that can be uniform, and benefit from economies of scale are better done at higher levels. So which is why issues like language and culture and kind of state board education, all of that sits with the states. And then there is the third tier, which is even the state is too big. Because like we said, most states in India, the top 15 states in India would each be in the top 20% of the world's countries by population. They're in the top 40 countries in the world. And so these are massive entities, right? Massive. So even a state is too big, okay, to be looking at, is the teacher showing up or is the doctor showing up, correct? So what we want is you want to put service delivery, right, really should be in kind of the control of local governments, right? Because there is then local accountability. And like we discussed in the previous episode, it also makes the politics more aligned to service delivery because the local election is then fought on service delivery, right? So today, the reason politically service delivery is not so salient is a vote is a very blunt instrument on which you're expressing your preference over so many dimensions of policy. So, but this way you make democracy work better by unbundling the vote, correct? So anyway, so that's kind of just the federal point. Now let's then, because that's deeply connected to the public finances, right? Which is where you started. So coming back to economies of scale, right? So what this kind of conceptual framework clarifies is that it turns out that for revenue collection, okay, there are economies of scale. Whereas for expenditure, it needs to be more customized.
Yeah.
Okay? So, which is why the way the Indian fiscal system is designed is that more of the taxes, about roughly 60% of our taxes, 60 to 65% of our tax revenues are collected centrally, but about 60% of our spending happens locally. Okay? And so, how do we bridge that gap? And that is partly what the Finance Commission does. Okay, so you got major tax instruments like the income tax, customs, all of this are collected by the central government. Right? Now, GST is kind of split half and half, but you got major instruments that are, so the states, if you look at what are the revenue instruments with the states after GST, it's a lot fewer, right? There's excise, so there's petroleum and alcohol, there's stamps and registration and property and stuff like that. But more of the revenue is actually controlled by the government of India.
So maybe Karthik, I'll also maybe contextualize. Listen, I mean, a lot of listeners watching this podcast probably work somewhere. So when we get our monthly paycheck and taxes deducted, most of it is GST. So that is going straight to central government.
So not the GST, the TDS, you mean the income tax. Correct? Yeah. So income tax goes completely to the central government.
Right, got it. But when we're outside locally, let's say you are buying something in the grocery shop or petrol, so that tax is going to state government.
No, so the petrol and alcohol are the only two taxes that are outside the GST.
Okay.
And those go directly to the state government.
Got it.
But everything else that is GST is kind of split 50-50 between central and state. So the GST itself was kind of coming back to this point about first principles of federalism, right? So it's a very fascinating case study, right? Of how there are some areas where we need to decentralize more and other areas where centralizing makes sense. Okay? And so GST was an area where basically what used to happen is we used to have the system of VAT, and then because each state had its own kind of tax rates, then you had kind of octroi, which was adding barriers to movement of goods between states. So from a basic economics perspective, it made sense to say that, listen, we are not leveraging the size of India as one market by having all of these frictions to movement of goods and services across states, right? So the fundamental economic logic of GST is to say that to get the benefits of size of one market, you want to minimize the frictions. And this is exactly what the Eurozone did, right? Why did they give up their autonomy on currencies to have the euro? And and there's a well-established literature in macroeconomics, what's called the optimal currency area. Right? And we can talk about that separately. But in a way, India, so whether it's the US, whether it's Europe, whether it's India, these are kind of large federal systems and are constantly trying to figure out, right, what happens at what level. So anyway, so coming back to taxes. So GST, it made sense to kind of centralize that so that you would have one market, right? Now, the cost is that you get the benefits of the economies of scale, but the states have given up autonomy, in terms of setting their own VAT, which is exactly what the Euro countries did when they gave up their currencies to have the Euro, right? So you give up your autonomy on setting your money supply and controlling your interest rates, but in return for lower frictions in economic transactions. And the general kind of consensus is that the benefits of increased economic transactions outweigh the costs, right? But yeah, so coming back to the larger fiscal structure, so that's kind of why about 60 to 65% of revenue collection is at the center, but about 60% of expenditure is in the states. And that gap is bridged largely by the Finance Commission.
Clarify one more point before we move on to, how the budget is distributed is also the full revenue portion. One of the things I learned from the book is, and I'm going to do my numbers in, maybe $1 billion. So roughly, am I rounding everything, is the government expenditure overall each year is something like $700 billion or so, 550 lakh crores, like roughly that, right? But the government, that money is not collected in tax. Only about 75% of that is tax. So other 25% of the money that government spends is debt, right? Which, sounds massive. And now, given that the government expenditure is about 1/5 of the size of GDP, so they've transferred about 4-5%. The deficit as a percent of GDP is 4-5%. So that's a significant amount of money that government is borrowing every year, and the whole, debt burden must continue to increase. So, what's the right way to look about that? What's the right ceiling on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think each of this, one could have a mini course on, right? See, at some level, the basic logic of debt at the government level is not that different from the household level. Which is, we have a rule of thumb that says don't borrow, okay? But there are times when borrowing makes sense, right? So borrowing makes sense, particularly when you're going to invest in things that are amortized over a long period of time, okay? So if I'm buying a house that has a 20-year life expectancy, if I'm investing in kind of an expensive college degree that will pay off over 30 years. So there, in those cases, debt makes sense because you're matching kind of the payment structure to the earning structure, right? So if I had to pay upfront for my entire house, we would never be able to buy a house. So there are places where debt absolutely makes sense, correct? Because it allows you to bring forward the consumption of a durable good, right? And spread it. So the basic rule of thumb that applies to individuals at some level applies to government as well, which is it makes sense to borrow if the rate of return of what you're spending on is higher than your cost of borrowing. Okay, so if I have an investment opportunity that's going to give me 15% return and my cost of debt is 5%, I should borrow, right? Because it's going to increase value over time. Okay, so borrowing per se is not a problem. But if I'm borrowing if I'm doing credit card debt and spending 15-20% and kind of ballooning my interest payments, even that is occasionally okay. Maybe I have a crisis, obviously if I have a health emergency, if I have some emergency, I need to survive. So in which case, taking on that high interest debt makes sense. But in general, a good rule of thumb is that you borrow for investment and not for consumption. So consumption should happen from current income. Okay, so our lifestyle, should be matched to our income. Okay? And if you want to invest, you borrow. Okay, and I think that rule of thumb broadly should apply to government as well. Okay? So which is why public finance economists, we don't stress about debt per se, but you look at debt to GDP ratio. Or sometimes I think what is even better is you look at the interest burden, in relative to tax revenues, because that's what gives you a sense of, is this sustainable? Okay. So in general, you can afford to borrow, you can afford to run a deficit, and partly because when there is economic growth, that the future tax revenues will grow. Okay. So which is why when we do macro public finance, we basically focus on debt sustainability. And there are certain parameters for how you do that. But it's exactly, the intuition is the same as any kind of, there's public finance, corporate finance, household finance, right? And the logic is the same, okay? Which is...
So where we put, India, I think again, from some numbers if I remember from the book is roughly 17% of the budget each year goes into interest payment.
Yeah.
So for 100 rupees, the government going to spend 17 rupees just going for paying interest. I don't know whether it includes principal or not of the money that has been raised in the past. Is that in the right range or?
Yeah, so I think, so here's a better way of thinking about it, right? So the way I think is better to think is how much of your borrowing each year is being borrowed for kind of investment versus consumption.
Yeah.
Because the 17% per se, it is sustainable, if you're growing. Okay. Yeah. So, but the question is, what are you borrowing for? Right? And are you borrowing for things that are going to boost future productivity? So I think the bigger concern in some ways when you look at the quality of expenditure is that so very roughly, right, our total expenditure. So sometimes more than billions of dollars, I find it easier to just focus on percentage of GDP because numbers change, every year. So on average, our total tax revenues and, center state, everything put together is about 18% of GDP. And our expenditure is close to 26%.
So the 8% is debt finance.
Is debt, right? Is debt and deficit. And that includes center and state, right? I know it varies a bit, okay, but roughly, that's the ballpark. So then the question is what are you borrowing for? Okay? And if you look at the data, it turns out that only about half your borrowing is being used for investment, and the rest of the borrowing. So all of your current tax revenue is going on what is called revenue expenditure, which is current expenditure, right? So interest, salaries, pensions, and a whole bunch of welfare schemes and everything else that's going out of the, that's annual recurring expenditure. And the capex, okay, is actually only about half of what you're borrowing for. Okay, so then that becomes, because now there's one subtle, tricky question, right? Is how should you classify spending on things like education and health? Okay, is that investment in human capital or is that current consumption in the revenue budget? Okay, so typically it shows up as a current revenue expenditure because most of the spending is on salaries. Okay, but you could argue, one could reasonably argue that this is in fact investment spending because you're investing in people. But yeah, so I think, but from a public, general tax paying public perspective, I think what's useful to understand is that about half of our spending every year is what is called committed expenditure, which is basically interest, which is committed, salaries and pensions. Okay, so, and that means that is today's tax revenue that is going to honor past commitments. Okay, so the discretionary spending is then much lower.
So out of the 25% the government will spend, half is just committed. There's nothing that anyone can do about it. These are past obligations.
Exactly.
They have to meet. Right? So That's a very important point to keep in mind. Like
And that is why things like, this old pension scheme, like, when people agitate, I think, yielding on that is a big mistake, okay? Because it's very tempting for politicians to kind of give way because you have to pay only 25 years down the line. So it buys you certain peace with the unions today, but that cost is going to come in the future. So which is why, most sensible public finance economists across the spectrum, right? Like, even left-leaning, like, people who have actually run budgets will tell you that this is actually, like a potentially, just a mistake because of how big that commitment is.
And I want to clarify your, this analogy of government finance versus household finance and the investment, what are we using for? So if you look at a household analogy, right, let's say you borrow money and you invest in education, they'll probably pay dividends for the rest of your life. Or even you buy a house, the value will appreciate versus you go on an expensive vacation.
Exactly.
So the equivalent of that, where the government is building, roads or institutions versus subsidies, you can subsidize today, but that's gone. That's not going to, yield any benefit. You're saying, of that 7-8% the government borrows every year, half of that just goes into here and now expenditure.
Exactly. And maybe, I think it's very important to caveat one important thing. See, the one way, there are 2 or 3 important ways in which the government is different from the household. Okay? The first is that the government typically will not go bankrupt, okay? Because it can always kind of, print money. Now, of course, you get inflation and there are other costs of that. But as long as your borrowing is domestic, that you will not go bankrupt. You can go bankrupt if you have foreign borrowing and you don't have foreign exchange. So that's one thing that makes governments different. Second is that the government also has massive equity obligations, right? Which kind of either companies or households typically don't have. Now, as a household, you may have a little bit of kind of redistributive obligations in your family. Like, when somebody is doing well, you kind of support others, etc. But the government has a much more systemic obligation. Okay. So sometimes it's easy to kind of, for tax-paying classes, to think about all welfare as saying, oh, this is government kind of giving away my money in return for votes. Okay. And that is a mistake, okay? Because welfare is a very, very important category of spending. Okay. And it's not just on humanitarian grounds. Okay. Well-designed welfare spending can also help productivity. And this is something which maybe we'll cover in the next episode, right? Because there are deep linkages between the structure of welfare and the structure of economic activity. So the point is not, welfare is not bad. The problem is the design of the welfare programs and the quality of the welfare spending, right? So often we spend our welfare money very, very badly. Okay. And we can get more into the quality of spending. So, and that's a very important clarification, right? Because sometimes, the tax-paying public often just associates any welfare program with a freebie, okay? And you kind of have this very binary characterization of saying freebies are bad and capex is good, okay? And that's not right. But within welfare programs, there are programs that are incredibly effective for both equity and efficiency. And there are other welfare programs that are really bad. They can support.
Right. So Karthik, maybe, for the benefit of people who have not studied economics, you mentioned that the governments can't go bankrupt and, because you can print more money. And sometimes people wonder, like, that's so easy, let government just print a lot more money and do whatever they need to spend. And you mentioned, it leads to inflation. Can you just break it down, explain in like much simpler terms so someone who does not know this concept is able to follow along?
So it's very simple, right? See, what is inflation? See, inflation is, this old definition of inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. And so effectively what happens is that money by itself is worthless, right? What matters is what can you buy with. Okay. So effectively, what preserves people's confidence in the money is that the value, every year when you have inflation, that is eroding the value of your money, right? Which is why one of the most important macroeconomic reforms around the world in the past 3-4 decades has been this idea of an independent central bank that will preserve the sanctity of the currency and kind of try to maintain inflation in a certain band. Because if the central bank is controlled by the finance ministry, then politically there is always an incentive to say, spend kar lo, because in the short term, you will get the benefits of the extra money and the inflation will show up later. But that has big long-term costs. Okay. So that's why you can't just print your way out of stuff. But what's interesting, and I have an op-ed on this, which you can link to, like, in the time of COVID, of saying, see, when you need to finance emergency expenditure, you effectively have 4 choices. Okay. You can say that I'm going to cut expenditure. You can say I'm going to raise taxes, right? Because effectively, think about COVID, right? It's this perfect storm of a macro crisis because revenue has come down because economic activity has slowed. Expenditure commitments have gone up because people don't have incomes, right? So the government is really in a squeeze. Okay. So at a time like that, you had 4 choices. You can cut some spending, you can raise some expenditure, you can borrow, which is basically saying that I'm going to spend, but I'm going to pay it back. Okay? Or you can print some money. Right? Now, the problem with just the printing money solution, so coming back to your original question, is the goods and services in the economy are the same. So if I'm just giving more money, then everybody's just going to bid it up and you're going to get inflation. So that doesn't solve the problem, right? But when I say the government can't go bankrupt, it has the option of saying that, listen, I can print some money. The cost of that is inflation. But which is why, for example, after major wars, you have the German hyperinflation in the early 1920s.
Yeah.
It's because they tried to print their way out of it and it doesn't work. Yeah. And then effectively a loaf of bread became more valuable than a wheelbarrow of cash because by the time you leave your home with the wheelbarrow and to reach the shop, the value has changed. So, which is why these are cheap fixes. But these are instruments, right, that the government has. So you can, 1%, 2% here, there. So it's a small amount, but actually, at that range, which is why even the RBI, it targets an inflation range, right? And not kind of a fixed value. But you want to give people confidence that the value of money, and this is very important, right? Because it matters for all investments. It matters if I'm going to put a fixed deposit, if, government wants to issue a bond at 8%, if I put money for 5 years in an 8% bond, but tomorrow inflation is 10%, then my return is negative 2%, right? And so to even have the confidence, and this is really important, right? Historically, why did people save their money in gold, right? It's because you didn't necessarily have confidence in the formal financial system. So, and as part of economic growth, you need to build people's confidence in the financial system. So you can't just inflate your way out of it. But that's why you have an independent central.
Got it. Okay, coming back to the state budgets, right? So again, going with the overall macro numbers, so I guess, say 60% or 2/3 of the budget is spent by state government, which is, 13-14% of GDP, or in absolute terms, I think roughly around $400 billion or so, like massive amount of money. How is it distributed to state? Because states are of, they have different populations, different level of, economic maturity. This must be a huge bone of contention of, who gets what. So how does the whole process work?
Yeah. So again, this is why it's, every time I teach, my undergrad class in the Indian economy, in almost every lecture, I will have something where I get the students to imagine they are the finance minister, right? Imagine, it's so easy to sit and criticize. That imagine you have to make these decisions, okay? How are you going to deal with these trade-offs? So similarly, you're asking all of the right questions, right? So yes, there is an economic principle that says it's more efficient to collect the money at a national level. Yeah. And then there is also the economic principle that it's more effective to spend locally. So how are you going to bridge that gap, right? So which is why we have the Institute of the Finance Commission. And the logic of the Finance Commission is every time we want a body to be more technical than political.
And Finance Commission is staffed by bureaucrats?
So Finance Commission is a constitutional body that is constituted every 5 years. That is usually the chairman tends to be like a very distinguished, public finance, some straddling of academics and policy.
Okay.
So if you look at who have been the past 4-5 chairmen of the Finance Commission. So this one is Dr. Arvind Panagariya, who is the former vice chairman of Niti Aayog, and a very distinguished academic economist who's also been in policy. The 13th Finance Commission was Dr. Vijay Kelkar, one of India's most distinguished public finance economists, who was the architect of the GST. The 14th Finance Commission was chaired by Dr. Y.V. Reddy, former RBI governor. The 15th was by Shri N.K. Singh, who has also been in the planning commission across both UPA and NDA governments. So generally the tradition is you try to make it non-political and you try to put people with a certain amount of public interest stature, precisely because it is a deeply political process. Okay. So then what happens is the terms of reference of the Finance Commission are normally set by the Finance Ministry, and historically, so there are two main things that the Finance Commission does. It says, it works on what is called vertical devolution, which is how much of the total money of the divisible pool should be controlled by the central government and how much by the state governments. And then there's the second question of horizontal devolution, which is within the state pool, how do you distribute that across states? Okay. Now, the subtle thing is that 60% that I talked about of spending by the states, it's actually, one views it's less than that because it includes, so one of the complicated issues about deciding is the money spent at the center or state is there are many what are called centrally sponsored schemes. So these are schemes that are designed by the center, but which require the state to put in certain amount of matching money and are implemented by the state. So the state doesn't have design control, but it has implementation control. So what I have done in that chapter, which other experts do, we take centrally sponsored scheme money and assign it 50-50, because it's one of these hybrid things, designed by the center, implemented by the state. But the the question of how does the finance commission, then determine what happens at the vertical level itself, I think, is an evolving question. So one of the big things that happened in the 14th Finance Commission till the 13th, the split used to be that the states were getting about 32% of that divisible pool. Because the center would want a lot more control to kind of design nationwide schemes. But the 14th Finance Commission took a big jump and made that into 42% from 32 to 42. So that was a big shift. And
then, was which year?
This 14th Finance Commission would have been around 2014, right? Because it happened between the transition of the UP and NDA government. So I think 14th submitted its report then, 15th submitted its report in. I think 15th got delayed a bit because of COVID, right? So they took an extension. And so, 14, 15, is when the 14th Finance Commission happened. And then so there's the vertical devolution, and then there is this part about horizontal devolution, right? How do you, and that also ends up having a whole range of criteria. So some of this is population, some of this is kind of, just poverty and need. But some of it is also you want to incentivize certain elements of good governance. So they put a certain amount of weight for states' own revenue mobilization because it's a very complex problem. See, and here is the simple intuition. In any situation in life, if I'm providing insurance for bad outcomes, I'm reducing the incentives to work hard. So there is always this tension between ethical aspects of redistribution and preserving the incentive effects. For effective governance.
It's almost like a matching grant. You raise more tax, then we'll give you more.
But I'll give you a simple problem, right? Simple thing, right? So if you look at Bihar, it's one of the poorest states in the country. But it still did something which I think was completely kind of, I would go as far as to say, call it dumb. I very rarely use such term like that. But it was really kind of misguided. That people like, and which is prohibition, right? So, and a state like Bihar, right? So not only was it about the cost of revenue in terms of 4,000 or 5,000 crores, which is a large amount of money, but it also kind of diverted law enforcement capacity, towards prohibition. So now the question from the Finance Commission's perspective is that Bihar comes and says that I don't have money to do my things, right? But the point is, apne paon pe kuladi mari hai na, by kind of losing this revenue. So how much of that should then be made up by the government of India? So these are then the kind of really difficult questions.
Maybe up also, since you brought it up, maybe explain that point. This alcohol, from a state revenue point of view, itna important क्यों है? Because इस बिहार के एग्जांपल आप बोल रहे हैं कि 4-5 करोड़ साल का आना बंद हो गया प्रोहिबिशन की वजह से. आई थिंक बुक ऑल्सो टॉक्ड अबाउट कि प्रोहिबिशन का आइडिया देखने में तो सुनने में तो अच्छा लगता है कि वो अल्कोहल पूरा बैन कर दो, इट विल सोशल वेलफेयर के लिए अच्छा रहेगा and so on, but mostly it leads to a lot of bad outcomes, right? So why don't you
exactly. No, I think this is something that globally, we generally have evidence that this just doesn't work. And so there's a lot of a temptation to say, yes, there's no question alcohol causes kind of a bunch of social problems, But the problem with banning something that there is a lot of demand for is it never goes away. It just goes underground, and it gets criminalized, So what ends up happening under prohibition, and in fact, in the US, people like Al Capone, like the entire mafia got built because of prohibition. Because when you move something that people want out of the legal sphere, it goes into the illegal sphere where it's then controlled by the mafia, And so prohibition almost always dramatically weakens the state, It weakens the state because you are depriving it of revenue. You are kind of creating a mafia around something that there's demand for. You are diverting law enforcement towards because you're chasing prohibition, there's evidence that says actually serious crime went up, because you're diverting, law enforcement from more serious crime. So the key to things like alcohol is to treat it as a problem, I'm not saying we condone it, but as with most things in moderation, it is kind of manageable, right? And so the key to alcohol is to treat it as a public health issue, not as a criminal issue, right? And so and then the basic principles of taxation is that you want to tax things that are bad, things that create negative externality. So again, by bad, I want to be clear here. I am not moralizing, आपको जो करना है अपने घर पे आपको पीना आप पी लो, but अगर आप पी के किसी और को मारते हो, then it becomes a social issue. अगर आप पी के गाड़ी चला के किसी और को एक्सीडेंट कराते हो, then it becomes a social issue, correct? So the way I would treat alcohol is like anything that you do that negatively affects somebody else is a crime. Okay, so we will still prosecute you for domestic violence. We will still prosecute you for drunken driving, and we will put you in jail. Okay, there's no question about that. Okay, so the point is that what you want to go after is the action that hurts somebody else, right? Now, if you are going to drink to, if you're going to socially kind of get together and have a couple of drinks, then I'll say, take it. But this is a good thing for me to tax, right? So Tamil Nadu, on the other hand, gets over 30,000 crores of revenue.
What percent of their budget is 30,000 crores?
So about 12%. Okay.
Well, Tamil Nadu ka pura, when the state government entire budget ka 12% alcohol tax
comes from alcohol taxes.
Amazing. And many other states are saying this at least 7-8%, right?
It's big. Okay. So you've got the Tamil Nadu one. So the interesting thing is, in both cases.
So basically, alcohol by tax karke aap free education, free health, so like
exactly, right? So in fact, the interesting thing is, so the Tamil Nadu, how are they able to finance their welfare state? Okay. So they have some of the most generous welfare programs, right? Like they do a bunch of programs for women. So one option, both policies of prohibition and both the Bihar model and Tamil Nadu model were motivated by saying we want to kind of, these are pro-women policies, okay? Because women suffer from domestic violence and therefore we will ban the alcohol, okay? But the Tamil Nadu model is saying we will tax it and then use it to fund welfare, which also disproportionately benefits women, okay? So my own submission, is that the Tamil Nadu model is actually a much better model because you're never going to eliminate, okay, people's desire to drink. And globally we've seen this, okay? So treating it as a public health issue and therefore also using it as a source of revenue, and bringing everything, making it legal, so then the only part that is criminal is when I'm hurting somebody else. Okay, and let's be very, very clear and have that distinction. So that's.
And is this topic in which there is a consensus among economists, or there are different?
I think for the most part. Okay, for the most part, I think most economists, right, would say that we need tax revenue. Okay, and it's better to tax things that have negative externalities. So let me explain this. Right? Since you wanted me to, get into some basics. What is a tax? Okay. So one of the problems of taxation is that the cost of a rupee of tax revenue is higher than 1 rupee. Okay. Because there's the administrative cost, there is the compliance cost, and there is the distortion in terms of behavior. Okay. So in general, what is a tax? A tax changes the prices. Okay. So if I put an income tax on your labor, it reduces your incentive to work. Okay. So, but if I put a tax on something that has negative effects on society, then that's good because it is disincentivizing. So what are the things we should put taxes on? We should absolutely be having road taxes, congestion charges, because every car on the road is adding cost to every other car, okay, which is not captured. And that's what Singapore does so beautifully, right? So what does Singapore do? They tax the wazoo out of cars, out of roads, out of everything that is a private good that has negative social externalities. And then they use that to fund some of the best public transport in the world, And so that's the kind of, you want to tax activities that add negative consequences to others that are not being priced. So alcohol is something that has negative externalities, but it is not at the level where banning is worth it. Most activities, banning is almost always a mistake. Okay, like in most of them, right? In almost every case, you're going to be better off by taxing it, making it a revenue source, and regulating it, and treating whatever negatives there are, by regulating it rather than banning it, you keep it kind of above ground as opposed to underground. Okay? So that's a general principle that I think most economists would agree with.
Okay, so let's come back to this federal versus state finance. आप थोड़ा ये भी एक्सप्लेन करिए कि जो now बजट का डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन हो गया, मान लीजिए 40%, 60%, बट वो सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट कहाँ पे खर्च करती है और स्टेट गवर्नमेंट अकॉर्डिंग टू कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन उनका पर्व्यू क्या है? So people have broad picture कि पैसा ज़्यादा कहाँ है?
Exactly. So great question. Okay, so there are some things that are completely in the domain of the center. Okay, so defense, right? Defense, foreign affairs, all of that is purely with the center. Then another way to think about what should be in the domain of the center is anything that requires coordination across states, right? So if you're building national highways, national waterways, so even for a highway system, it doesn't make sense for one state to build a road and another state to build a road, and those two roads don't meet. Yeah. So when you need to coordinate, anything that requires coordination, okay, it makes sense for it to be done by the central government. Yeah. Okay? So most national infrastructure projects, right, are with the center. And then there are certain aspects of welfare, okay, that it makes sense for there to be flagship national programs. And the basic logic is, of course, we don't do this in practice, okay. So let me give you the first principles logic and then what happens in practice. The first principles logic of welfare being central is as you get more and more migration, okay, as people move across states, then if your welfare system is tied to your state, then it becomes kind of adds frictions again.
Yeah.
So the more migration there is, like, the more it makes sense for there to be certain centralized kind of welfare schemes. So, because again, in practice, what ends up happening is a lot of the discussions within government ends up being focusing on turf. Okay. But the way we should think about it is what is good for citizens. Always put citizens first. Okay.
Yeah.
And if you put citizens first, then the logic of the central government becomes these kind of functions. Now, in practice, what happens is the central government also plays a huge role in a lot of the social sector. Now, what has happened is constitutionally, these were issues that were supposed to be fully with the states. Okay. So school education, primary health, law and order, police, district courts, right? These are all with the states, right? But what has happened over time is the central government has taken more and more of an active role, partly because there was a perception that states were not doing enough. Okay? And so if you looked at the patterns of state government spending, right, there was a sense that if you really want to achieve national goals, okay, on education, national goals on health, national goals. So, and coming back to economies of scale, what has happened is that because we were a low-income country that didn't have that kind of, say, policy-making, research, analytical capacity in each of the states, most of that intellectual machinery for the policy design was sitting in Delhi.
Yeah.
Because not only were all the think tanks sitting over there, also all of the global foreign aid agencies, the bilaterals, right? World Bank is there, UNICEF is there, UNESCO is there. Like, so all of the sources of technical support that would come into designing social programs were also sitting in Delhi. So then what happened in the 80s and 90s was we saw this big increase in, and also after that, in what were called centrally sponsored schemes. So the idea was that constitutionally, the center has very little to do with primary education. But the way the center took on such a big role was by creating these schemes that they would fund, they would design, they would fund 2/3, right? And then they would tell the state that you put matching funds so that you can access this. But in return, you have to do this. Okay. So it was a way for the center to see the logic of central involvement. And again, it cuts both ways. Okay? The logic of central involvement is to say, कि boss, अगर हम नहीं करेंगे तो आप अपने आप नहीं कर रहे हो, right? Like, I mean, so, and we have to step in. And the way, even though it's constitutionally yours, the way we will kind of make you do what we think you should do is by tying money to it. Okay, so, and the centrally sponsored schemes then basically took over a big part of kind of the government of India's functioning, because and effectively policy design in many of these areas happens in the center with implementation in the states. Now, again, it's a double-edged sword. So the positives of this is that in kind of the weaker capacity states, okay, and this comes back to the Finance Commission as well. See, think about, so there are two modes through which redistribution happens from high income to low income states. One mode is through the Finance Commission, because Finance Commission gives you untied money. Okay, so Finance Commission is using these formulae of population and distance, poverty, etc. And there's a built-in redistribution there, which is untied. Okay. Then there is a second mode of redistribution, which is tied, right? So when the centrally sponsored scheme comes and saying, okay, I'm going to put this much money. So typically, more, if that is allocated based on population, then again, that ends up doing a little bit of redistribution. So coming back to therefore center and state, the center's budget share is big, partly because of these centrally sponsored schemes. But in practice, a lot of the expenditure is classified as state because most of the expenses in service delivery sectors are salaries. But the teachers and the doctors and the police are all employed on the state government payroll. So, which is why it shows up primarily as a state expenditure, even though the design is often coming from the center.
तो दो एग्जांपल लेते हैं. I'm looking at this table, from your page 167. यहाँ पे macro level पे कि पूरा budget का distribution क्या है. तो health, let's start with health. 36,000 crores is central spending and 1,49,000 crores is state spending. So 1:4 ratio almost between the two. But most of us may think about कि health में public health infrastructure अगर अच्छा नहीं है, we kind of look to central. Similarly, education में it says 69,000 crores by central, but 5,08,000 crores by state. So again, 1:8 ratio. Like for every 1 rupee the central government spending, 8 rupees are being spent by the state government. But if you look at national education policy and so on, like so much expectation from center. And I guess what you're saying is partly while states are spending money, some of it is influenced by center because of the centrally sponsored scheme. But ultimately, where is the more responsibility? किसी state में education level अच्छा नहीं है,
correct,
तो finally किसकी गलती है?
Fantastic question. And my personal view is that we need to be kind of looking much more at the states. Because see, now you're absolutely right that even though a lot of the spending is classified as state, right? I mean, a lot of the design comes from the center. And again, the reason we look to the center is because, see, what has happened with the centrally sponsored schemes is at one level, it has helped kind of build certain uniform standards. But one of the things I talk about in the federalism chapter is one cost of centrally sponsored schemes is it has weakened the policy making muscles at the state level. Okay, because you look to the guidance from the center, वहाँ से पैसा आ रहा है, आप उस guidelines को follow करके आप scheme बनाइए, like whereas what you really should be doing is getting people to apply their mind about what is needed in their states and take responsibility. So the fact that in education and health over 80% of the spending happens at the state level, like I said, it mainly reflects the fact that the employees are the biggest cost and they are on the state government's payroll. Okay. But one simple way of saying why the state government is more important is that a lot of the performance measurement and management of the staff is completely with state and local government. And a lot of the slippages are really in those areas of governance. Okay. So one of the and here is actually a very interesting perspective on government of India. Okay, so the government of India's challenge with regard to dealing with states is the same as, say, the World Bank's challenge in dealing with developing countries. Okay, so what is the challenge? The challenge is the countries that need the most support are also the countries with the weakest governance. Okay, so the same problem happens in India. Okay, which is the states that need the most support from the center are also the states with the weakest governance. Okay, so what ends up happening is, therefore, when government of India puts in money, they say we need to put in all these conditionalities to make sure that paisa waste na kare. Okay, which is the same thing that happens when the World Bank kind of does aid programs. Now, but the problem with that is, it may be necessary for the weaker governed states, but it is a handicap for the better governed states. So simply, if you look at it, if you look at all India average, there are some states that are much better. So and this goes back to the cost of over centralization, right? Because then I can't accommodate diversity and I have to try to cater to the whole country with one set of policies, right? So the joint secretary who's designing a program in Delhi is most concerned about kind of the more underperforming areas. Okay. So he might think about, I need all of these guidelines because UP Bihar my governance is weak and I need to do this. But that is actually kind of micromanaging a Tamil Nadu, Kerala that is doing better anyway. Okay, so the challenge, therefore, is how do you then balance the accountability for the places that are poorly governed, but kind of respect the autonomy of the states that are already doing well. Okay, so which is why one of the things I've talked about is the idea the performance-based financing to dur ki baat hai. But come se come, we should have more performance-based autonomy. Okay, like mean that if you're doing well, please go ahead, right? Like and keep doing well, and we will focus our attention from the center more in the places that are not doing well. But but the larger point about who should be responsible, see, it is joint at some level, right? Because these are kind of items on the concurrent list. So the center does have a role with regard to program design and funding. But where the buck stops for me in service delivery is at the state, and frankly, it should be local. Okay, that states and. Because if the buck stops with states, right, then the states will have to apply their mind to the governance reforms that are needed to deliver. And the decentralization agenda then has to be driven more by states than by the center, because that's where the biggest gaps are.
Understood. One more thing, and just on the budget side, which caught my attention is, so as you mentioned, salary is a big part of the budget. And total salary for government employees, this is based on 2019-20 budget, is about 12 lakh crores. Which is about $15 billion. And so which is fine, that's the size of the government, employer, central, state level, and so on. But simultaneously, half of that, 6,48,000 crores, so roughly $7-8 billion is pensions, which is, amazing. On one hand, obviously, it's a social welfare, and people who have, service government should have some kind of support in the later years and so on. But, it's like almost the money you're paying to active government servants, half of that is going to people who are no longer in service. It's also a huge burden on government some ways. And I don't know, how does economists think about that, the pension versus, other social welfare schemes and so on, and what's the right way to manage it?
Yeah, no, absolutely, right. And I think, again, these are the innards of the government in terms of the effectiveness and efficiency that most people in the public discourse don't pay attention to, right? I mean, but those were in the government. So which is why one of the very important reforms that was again bipartisan that happened in 2004-5, was moving from the old pension scheme to the new pension scheme, right? So a lot of these big liabilities, they come from the old pension scheme, because old pension scheme is what was a defined benefits program, okay, which is when you retire, you're going to get a certain guaranteed amount throughout your life based on your last drawn salary. But then the liability on the government keeps increasing because life expectancy is going up, and because the pensions get indexed to the future pay commissions, okay, not just to inflation. So if it was indexed only to inflation, that would be reasonable because you're maintaining the purchasing power. But by indexing it to future pay commissions, you are now kind of, every time there's a pay commission revision of current employees, you get this massive increase in outlook for past employees. Okay, so that itself was a huge fiscal burden. So one of the important things that the new pension scheme did is it converted it into what's called a defined contribution system, okay, which is you contribute, the government contributes, it goes into an account, and then it is your money, okay, but the liability is fixed, right? So yes, as an employee, you deserve a certain amount of pension. That's a part of an employment contract. But how to do that in a way that the liability is bounded and not kind of unbounded? But what is now happening is because obviously as people are retiring, like, and people are living longer, they want, better, stronger pensions. And so there's massive agitation to say, let's go back to the old pension scheme. But that is why every right-thinking public finance economist needs to kind of strongly oppose that. And most of us do, Now, there is one thing to be said, that people do value some predictability. And so there is some case for figuring out annuities, okay, whereby you can take the lump sum that you get at the time of retirement and then figure out through kind of publicly regulated, entities that can I annuitize a part of this so that I have at least some fixed income. So that I think is a reasonable conversation to have. But this question about are we spending too much, too less? Again, it is hard to answer that question without kind of seeing what are you getting for that money. But where I will argue that we are not getting much for the money. And that's why the micro research matters. You see, I can't just look at the macro level and saying we're spending this much, it's too much or too less, right? Because whether I'm spending too much or too less depends on what am I getting for that. Okay. So, but what the micro research shows is that unconditional pay increases have zero impact on delivery. Then you say, okay, I'm spending this money badly, which is then a key part of what that personal chapter is about, right? Which is how do we take our payroll bill, which is 20% of government expenditure, and get better value for money for that.
Understood. Now, taking this, going back to, where we started, this idea of, in some ways, more empowerment, but also more accountability for state. And I think throughout the book, you've talked about, I think at some point, potentially having a chief economic advisor at the state level. And few new commissions also you propose that states can consider to just better manage their budget and have just overall better transparency and accountability and the whole, high performance culture that we like in organizations to kind of take that to states. So let's talk about that. First of all, how realistic is it? How receptive you have seen various state governments about such ideas, but fundamentally talking about, transforming how state governments are run.
Correct. So let me kind of break that into two parts. Okay. Like, see, there is one part about what are some of the outcomes we want. And then there's a second part, which is how do you institutionalize such practices, right? So let's first take the first part, okay? And one of the most important recurring themes in the book is this idea of quality of expenditure, right? So which is how do you improve the bang for the buck, right? And because we spend so much, again, like we were talking, in a company, right? So you can think about the whole government as this massive enterprise with 10 million employees, with a budget of 55, 60,000 crores, right? Lakh crores, right? And we put only a fraction of our attention, okay, into that relative to how much a company chairman would put for something that is 0.01%, right? Of that, okay. So, and which is why, and we'll connect this back to, some of what I say in chapter 18 about the role of, say, philanthropy, okay, in kind of contributing to some of these investments, what I call strategic philanthropy. Okay, we'll come back to that. But the core point I'm making is at the budget, right? See, if you look today at how budget processes work in most state governments, okay, it is every department पिछले साल का budget लेके उसका 8% या 10% लगा के आप भेज देगा. This is my budget request for next year. Okay, and most of the time these budgets get sanctioned without much interrogation of the quality. Okay, so the thing is, finance is able to say yes or no. Okay. But finance is not able to go back to the department and saying, you figure out how to do this cost effect. Okay. And that is, so one of our deepest structural problems is that departments have very little incentive for cost effectiveness. Okay. And that's because their incentive is to maximize their budget. Okay. So they have certain norms and think these are my costs and this is how much I need to deliver this program. And finance will go up or down. Okay. So invariably, every department will ask for more money than finance has. Then finance will say no because they don't have the money. And department will say, acha paisa nahi mila, hum kar nahi sakte. Okay. And then you're stuck in that loop, right? Whereas what the evidence shows is that there is so much low-hanging fruit whereby you can be more cost-effective to deliver the same outcomes. So how do you create that incentive for cost-effectiveness? So it's one very, very simple idea, right? So what happens today, if a department is efficient and saves money, finance will take the money back. Okay. So, and there's one school education commissioner in a state who once told me that they did work to kind of get rid of bogus enrollments. Okay. So they managed to cut in about 5% and they saved. And they said, we've saved this money, but here is a bunch of new schemes that we would like to do. Okay. But finance took the money back and then said, thank you very much. So then in that world, they have no incentive to do that. Right? So one very, very, very simple idea. Okay.
I think somewhere you also mentioned that people will just whitewash the walls, towards the end of the year to make sure they're,
So that's a completely different problem. Okay. That is a use it or lose it problem. Okay. Which is the way the budget works is that it's a fiscal year. And then if you typically the money is sanctioned at the beginning, but the money will show up only like 8 months into the year. And then if you don't use it in the last 3 months, you will lose the money. So then you have to create some expenditure. So whitewashing is what you can do. So there's a lot of such kind of procedural examples. But coming back to big picture reforms, right? So see, basically when we say improving quality of expenditure, right? There is reforms at the level of budget allocation. There is reforms at the level of fund flows. There is reforms at the level of... So budget allocation is about sectors and programs. Then there is reforms about incentivizing cost effectiveness within departments on an ongoing basis, right? Which is a very difficult problem. But again, finance is the place where you need to start having those conversations, right? So 2 or 3 ideas, okay? So on budget allocation, what I have proposed is, this very, very simple but powerful 2x2 framework. Okay, saying that if you are a CFO in a company and somebody is coming to you with a proposal saying, I need 10,000 crores or 1,000 crores, okay, to make some investment, you will demand a really detailed discounted cash flow and saying, okay, show me what is the expected ROI, show me the scenarios on this, show me the sensitivities, and then you will kind of form a judgment as a CFO as to say, am I going to deploy this money? You will do that even for 100 crores, okay? But now in the government, we do thousands of crores, tens of thousands of crores without that kind of discipline, okay? So the first basic thing is to say, can you subject every spending proposal above a certain amount to a certain ROI kind of framework? And even if there are assumptions will be needed, but at least articulate what are the assumptions that is justifying the rate of return on that investment. Okay. So, and this is again, it's like most of what I'm talking about here is such management 101. Okay. So, which is why sometimes I feel like every CFO and CEO should read it, because the kind of scrutiny that you have in your own company, if you brought one, an element of that to government, the return is so much higher. Okay. So one part is just bringing that discipline of ROI analysis. So now you will come back and, somebody will reasonably say, but wait, government is not just about return on investment. They are also about welfare. They are about equity. They're about kind of, distribution. So I said, fine, absolutely. But let us think about the quality of our welfare expenditure. Okay. So how do you think about welfare? So usme, we are not thinking ROI, but we are thinking, okay, what is the justification for the welfare? It is you want to support the poor. Okay. So let us analyze the quality of welfare on 3 dimensions. The first is targeting. Okay. So who is getting the money as per the program design? Second is delivery. Okay. Which is once you look at both the leakages and the other frictions, okay, is the money being delivered to the person who's truly vulnerable? And the third is what economists call distortions, okay, which is, does the structure of your welfare program add other costs to the economy? Okay, so let's do a deep dive on this, because I think it's a very useful way to illustrate how to think about quality of welfare expenditure. Okay? So let's take the case of two rural policies. On one hand, you have something like NREGA, and National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. On the other hand, you have free electricity for farmers. Okay. Now, both of these are rural policies broadly. But NREGA is one of the best welfare programs you could have, and free electricity for farmers is literally one of the worst policies we have in the country. Now, how do you kind of see that, right? Because And that's why I use this 2x2 framework of saying, let's look at policies on an efficiency axis, which you can measure by return on investment. And let's look at them on an equity axis, okay, which is it in fact reaching the most marginalized? Okay? And now, what happens? There's reasonable people can disagree about region 2 versus region 4, okay? Because in region 2, you improve efficiency at the cost of equity. Okay, and we can even maybe show this graph, right? And and in region 4, so what's an example of a policy that improves efficiency but hurts equity? Would be GST. Today we have 5 slabs, okay? But moving to fewer slabs would improve efficiency because it makes the transaction more seamless. But it would hurt equity because you would increase the tax rate on some of the items consumed by the poor. Okay? On the other hand, you have policies that improve equity. Okay? That might be, say, the PDS, okay, which helps food security for the poor, but typically comes at the cost of high inefficiency because of the structure of procurement, leakage, dual prices, etc. Okay, so reasonable people can disagree about this, but one of the key points I want to highlight is so much of our spending goes to items that are bad for equity and bad for efficiency. Okay. And if you just bring in a basic public finance analytical lens and share that with the public, you can move our public discourse to say, let's cut our spending on those items and use it to fund ideas that will improve equity and efficiency. And that's how you kind of accelerate development in an inclusive way. Okay. So coming back to NREGA, and see, so what the research in NREGA shows, okay, is that it is remarkably well targeted because it goes to the poorest, because typically it's landless laborers, right? I mean, who are the most vulnerable, because if you're a small holding farmer, you still have some land, but the landless are the most vulnerable, right? Means so it primarily benefits the most vulnerable. The second reason it benefits them is, even if you don't directly get work on NREGA, you benefit because it improves the market wage rate for everybody, because you now have the government playing this outside option. Okay. And the research shows that it is also incredibly effective for economic efficiency, because by boosting money in the hands of the poorest, you're also getting a bit of a fiscal multiplier in terms of local demand. So this is one of my most important research papers that came out last year. And, people who are interested can go read it. But it's been a really striking result that it's been such an effective program that improved both equity and efficiency. Okay. On the other hand, if you look at our farm subsidies, right? So free electricity for farmers, if you just look at plot the land distribution, and if you assume that you're consuming subsidy proportional to your land ownership, which is a reasonable assumption, you will see that roughly the top 5% of landowners get about 50% of the benefits. And the bottom...
And they're probably very rich farmers.
And they're the rich farmers, right? And so who's getting the biggest subsidies? The person with the biggest land, right? So we call it farmer welfare, right? But if you dig in, you'll see that most of the benefits are going to the top 5%. Okay. So it's bad in terms of targeting. Now, it's bad in terms of delivery. Why? Because a lot of agricultural power is not even metered. Okay. So then what happens is, a lot of the discoms, the electricity distribution companies, they hide their other inefficiencies, losses under agriculture power. Okay. So then you also are increasing the inefficiency in the entire electricity distribution systems. And the discoms, that's why the discoms are typically bankrupt in almost every state. And that is delivery. Okay. And then it's also a disaster for what I call distortions, right? Because you're changing prices. Remember what I said? A tax or a subsidy changes prices. So when you do free, a price is a beautiful thing. Why do we love prices? Because a price is this way of aggregating all the information in the economy of supply and demand and saying, this is what the market clearing price is. What is the value of this good? Okay? Now, when I make a price of something free, I'm basically encouraging overuse. Okay. So you are dramatically depleting the groundwater table because you made it free. And so that is an ecological disaster, because the groundwater, we have a water crisis, and 85 to 90% of India's water consumption is agriculture, right? And so if we have water crises in cities, people are not linking that, right? To the dysfunctional agriculture policy.
85 to 90% of water is used in agriculture.
And most of that, because of the structure of the electricity subsidies, is groundwater. So we are depleting our groundwater table faster than almost any other country in the world. And every year it becomes worse, because as the water table goes down, the amount of electricity energy I need to draw that water goes up, and it actually goes up quadratically, because of the depth and the gravity equation. Okay, so not quadratically, but non-linearly. Okay, so the point is that it's a disaster for equity because it's going to the richest farmers. It is kind of bad for delivery efficiency because you're kind of increasing inefficiency into your entire kind of discom ecosystem because it's not metered. Okay? See, And then the last part is the distortions on economic efficiency. One is kind of groundwater. Second is cropping. So today we want crop diversification. But like a finance minister of one state told me, he said, listen, paddy is the lazy man's crop. It is the safe option because I have free water. So I flood the fields. I have procurement. So it's a safe crop. So what happens is that even though you might get higher income and the country needs us to diversify away from paddy, we don't do that because of a combination of the structure of the subsidies and the structure of procurement. Okay. Now, some of these policies may have made sense in the 1960s. Okay. So to take historical perspective, in the 1960s, when we were suffering a crisis of food self-sufficiency, when we depended on US aid for PL 480, so it was reasonable for the leaders then to say, we will do what it takes to be food self-sufficient. Okay. And that included a combination of agriculture policies.
Some of the historical things, Karthik, when these subsidies are introduced, are they like time bound saying this is automatic expire after 25 years? Because it's become impossible to take it away. It becomes a perpetual thing, it doesn't matter what it is doing now.
Exactly.
But somebody is going to just cry and not let you make the thing.
Exactly, right? I mean, so let me just wrap up on the distortions, right? And then if you think about our climate crisis, right? Sorry, our pollution crisis, like most of it, a big contributor is the stubble burning, right? And so, but Punjab has no business growing paddy, at that time. And that creates then these downstream distortions, right? So much of this can be tied to kind of our dysfunctional. So coming back to thinking about quality of expenditure, this is where I'm saying welfare is not bad. I want to support the farmers, okay? But you can do that same thing through a set of income transfers or a set of instruments that will then not have all, so it'll be targeted better. So that's then an example of how do you think about quality of expenditure. So then so there are three meta levels, right? Because there is one point which is we did a deep dive on an example, okay, of quality of expenditure. Then there is a second part which is saying how can this kind of analysis improve the budget processes? Okay, so when I'm saying that we should have an equivalent of a chief economic advisor in every state, again, states are bigger than most countries, okay, and we don't.
Who does the economic policy for state today?
So the thing is, see, the finance department in most states, okay, they function more from a expenditure management perspective, okay, to say that can we afford this? But there isn't really a strategic budgeting cell, okay? Most state governments just don't have that. Now, Government of India has a little bit of that, which is why in Government of India Finance Ministry, there are 4 or 5 departments, right? There's Department of Expenditure, there's Department of Revenue, and then the Department of Economic Affairs. Okay, so the budget is usually made by the DEA, the Department of Economic Affairs, and DEA is what has the capacity for some of these intersectoral analysis. So the Indian Economic Service, for example, sits in the DEA. Okay, so that is the part of the Ministry of Finance that's expected to do some of this. And then historically, Planning Commission, Niti Aayog. So you at least have some instruments, okay, or some institutions that are supposed to do this intersectoral thinking. In the states, now historically, there were state planning boards that were supposed to do some of this. But even that historically was just very much about, okay, which sector am I prioritizing and where am I going to invest? But none of this kind of intersectoral linkages and analysis. So what is missing today in states is that you have a revenue department that's looking at revenue mobilization and expenditure. So finance ministries in most states are really like the Department of Expenditure, okay, because they are mainly focusing on, can I afford the spending? There is treasury management, which is kind of inflow, outflow of cash. What is my cash flow position? And certain amount of debt management, right? But a lot of this is still more at the viability level rather than the strategic level. Okay? And so that is a huge kind of low-hanging fruit, right? And so one of the things which I've been, now recommending, and the point is everybody wants it, but how do you build the capacity? Okay, so some of the work I'm now doing in my policy hat, right? So, which is why I've also built this nonprofit called CGIS, right? Which is the Center for Effective Governance of Indian States. And some of the work we're doing now with some state finance departments is starting, right? In some of this analytical capacity that is starting to do work on the quality of expenditure. I'll give you another very, very, very simple example, okay? So in government procurement, there is often, there is the sense that, there's a lot of corruption, okay? But if you look at the data and research on kind of corruption, what it shows is that over 80% of the waste in government is not corruption, it is just inefficiency.
Yeah.
Okay? And a lot of that inefficiency, like we can catch if we are able to do better analysis. Okay. So sometimes you can just look at something like procurement in civil works. Okay. Now, the biggest cost is often cement. And what our analysis in one of the states we worked in shows is that at the same time, there is so much variation in the price quoted for cement across contracts that are done by different departments in the government. So even if you're just able to do that analysis and provide that as a benchmark and saying, listen, if I just hit even the 10th or 20th percentile of this, there is a few hundred crores of savings just in that one line item. Okay. Whereas the cost of putting together this entire analytical cell might be like 5 crores. Okay. And we don't do it. Okay. Because that is then an example of the underinvestment in state capacity. So anyway, so the point is these are examples of analysis. Then there's a question about how do you institutionalize some of this capacity in the finance department, right? And which is why I'm saying kind of create something like an office of a CEA, or even if you don't want to call it a CEA, at least have a strategic budgeting cell, okay, that's able to systematically look at quality of expenditure in partnership with academic institutions, right? So every state actually has decent academic institutions, but the professors are functioning in their own silos. We talked about this last time about increasing the connection between research and policy. Right? So creating some of those institutional vehicles, that is the second step. Now, there is a third step, which is even more far-reaching. Okay, this is saying within the government, how do I do this better? There is a third step that says, listen, the opposition, okay, the problem in government today is when you're in opposition, you will promise whatever you need to get into power. And then you come. So there's this saying, that you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. Okay? So you keep kind of making whatever promises. And then when you have to do it, you say, oh, boy,
there's fine print.
There's fine print. Okay. So the highest level of institutional reform, okay, would be to bring a culture of fiscal responsibility to the larger political discourse by saying, let us have kind of a state public finance commission that has kind of technocratic leadership, but it has ex officio representation of the chief minister, finance minister, and leader of the opposition. Okay, like I mean, so that there is always visibility with regard to anytime anybody makes some commitment, that there is a fiscal analysis of like, what does this mean? So that you can just have a little bit more mature political dialogue. See, in the end, budgeting is a political decision. Okay, it is not a technocratic one. But the value of the economists and the technocrats is to say, politically, you have a certain set of objectives. You say, I want to deliver welfare to farmers. Okay. So that is your political prerogative. Okay? And that is a decision in the political domain. But the role of the economist is to say, given that objective, there are 10 different ways of getting there. And there are some that are incredibly inefficient and others that are more efficient. So let me give you this menu of ideas and let me explain to you, because this is not easy, right? I mean, it's easy to blame the politicians, but this is sophisticated analytical work. It takes kind of, serious experience, serious technical work. And then you need that interface, right? Between kind of the technical stuff, presenting the right data. See, coming back to farm reform, okay? We say it's very difficult, but tell me something. Has anybody gone up in parliament or assembly and actually presented this data? Just present the data, okay, and show this is the structure. 5% of the richest farmers are getting 50% of this benefit. Is this politically sustainable? Is this desirable? No. So a lot of the reform conversations first happen by just presenting the data. So that itself is the first.
I think the picture that's emerging to me is, if you look at, if we compare the government engine versus, let's say, a private company. Even if you're a private company with, 1,000, 2,000 crores of, budget, you will be hiring a lot of these MBAs. There's going to be a lot of rigorous statistical analysis, a lot of, scenario planning, and so on. Most state government, their budget, is ranges from few billions of dollars to a few tens of billions of dollars, depending on the size of the state, right?
Yeah, even I would say on average 200 to 500,000 crores. Like UP, I think. Funnily enough, I'm not thinking in dollars. I'm thinking in rupees. But yeah, I think UP budget last year was about 6.5 lakh crores.
6.5 crores. That's incredible. That's that's basically in dollar terms about $75 billion, right?
So, on a standalone basis, the 6th largest country in the world.
Yeah. So for those kind of budget, you will assume that you need best and the brightest of the country. I don't know, the government should probably hiring a lot of engineers and MBAs and have some of these functions and departments because see, the tax to GDP ratio is not going to go up. And yes, the first episode we discussed, the ratio is also not inching. But still, a humongous amount of money, even 10 or 20% more efficiency on that, can have dramatic impact. And I mean, most companies, we know as a business leader, you have a very progressive CEO, you can figure out a way to eke out extra 10 or 20% efficiency, and that in well-run companies.
Correct.
In the, when you analyze the government budget, there are a lot of inefficiencies. So with the just right kind of, the human resource infrastructure and analytical infrastructure, that's probably a crux of, if we can have much, much better run states, just professionally run, then with the budget they have, which is, which is not small by any stretch of imagination, and with better efficiency, you can have a serious impact on that.
Correct. And I want to make a very subtle and important point, right? See, sometimes I think there is a sense that, politics is the problem. And if we only had kind of more professionals, managing the budget, things would be fine. And I think that's actually a misguided response, because in the end, in a democracy, it is important that the ultimate decisions are taken by elected representatives of the people. Okay. But the value of the technocrat is kind of framing the trade-offs, right? I mean, in a way that we are able to take the right decisions that reflect kind of the political kind of sensibility, right? So coming back to people say, Acha, and this is one of the key kind of things I try to do in the book and even in my public discourse is that it is the duty of the technocratic economist, right, to make good economics, good politics. Okay, so people will, when I talk about the farm subsidy reform, okay, people say, this makes sense, politically impossible. Take it. But okay, do you give up on that? No, you say, okay, why? What are the political obstacles, right? And the first, so it goes, and this is in chapter 17, where we think about how policies are made and sustained, right? It's one very powerful framework is what is called ideas, interests, and institutions. Okay, so the value of the academic, the research, is to kind of present the right ideas in public discourse. So how many people actually know that? So we think about, okay, all welfare is freebie, okay? But how many people know that Narega is an outstanding program, whereas farm electricity subsidies are a disaster, okay? And so just even having that next level of nuance, okay, thinking about it. So the role of the ideas is to kind of present this analysis, and people are starting to do this. So in fact, what I would encourage every student, right, like, or every professor that who's watching this, is if you're an economics professor, economics teacher in any college in India, right, please teach kind of courses on public finance, right? And get students to analyze state budgets and take some of the frameworks and start doing quality of expenditure analysis in the state. So take the line items and saying, okay, where is the distribution of income? Where is this money going? The spatial incident. It's not rocket science. It's not rocket science, right? It's just basic accounting, okay? But at least start getting more and more people thinking about this, putting in the public discourse. So suppose we want to take a 10-year journey. See, we know the farm subsidies are unsustainable. Okay, we also know this is one of the most difficult reforms. But if you say that for getting to full potential, see, it's a much bigger thing than just the fiscal cost. Okay, and maybe we'll talk about this in the next episode when we talk about jobs. But one of the biggest challenges for economic growth and development in India is you need to accelerate our structural transformation. That today you have over 45% of the population in low productivity agriculture. A lot of that agriculture is kind of completely economically unviable. Okay, and it's only sustained by the subsidies, right? But the perversity of the whole thing is that the nature of our welfare system is that we are giving you subsidies to stay poor. Because if you try to get out of the farming, then you don't get the subsidy. Okay. So it is not just about the fiscal cost. It is one of the biggest impediments to the broader structural transformation in the Indian economy, is that the structure of our farm kind of policies are designed to keep people in poverty. See? And so, which is why in the social safety chapter, I talk about, there's this idea of a social safety net. Okay, but the problem with the net metaphor is you fall in the net and you stay trapped in the net. So the president of Singapore, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, has this great framing. We need social safety, but he says we need social safety trampolines and not social safety nets. That when you fall, we will catch you, but we'll design systems that help you bounce back. Okay, there is many of our policies that are designed to support the poor are actually keeping them trapped in poverty, right? So that's why coming back to, see, politicians are all kind of, yes, there's an element of every politician that has to do things to get elected, okay, for which they might do unsavory things. But once they're in office, they're also under obligation to deliver, okay? And they're all struggling. They are struggling, okay, because they feel they are connected to the population. They feel the pressure, they feel the needs, and they're looking for solutions. So it is the job of the technocratic class to kind of not just analyze the solutions, but present them in ways that make political sense. And the first part is just doing the analysis and showing, okay, boss, aapko farmer welfare karna hai. Like, aap is policy mein, like, you're spending this many 10, 20, 30,000 crores, and this is where the benefit is going. So then once you've got that, and of course, the problem is then there are vested interests, okay? And this then becomes the political part, which is why that is ultimately a decision that has to be navigated through the political process, right? The technocrats can just present this and saying, okay, boss, this is bad for equity, bad for efficiency, bad for the country. Okay. Then it becomes a political process of saying, if I'm going to do some reforms, maybe the top 3%, Now let's look at Narega, right? Narega was virulently opposed by big landlords because they faced higher prices. But that was a good policy. It was a good policy that required then a broader political process of saying that we need to do these things for the rural poor, and this is what we're going to do. So as an economist, I stay out of the political mobilization process, right? My job is to lay out the trade-offs and saying, now you figure this out. So there will be interest. And then the last part is institutions, okay, which is where coming to something like kind of farm sector reform. So my personal view is that it's so difficult, but the most promising role model we have is GST. So GST was a reform that economists talked about for a very, very long time. It took us 15 years to get it done. But there was a process. There was a Kelkar Commission report that said this is the vision of where we are going. And then there was kind of an interministerial state council that was set up. There was a process. All the issues were ironed out bit by bit by bit. And then there were a constitutional amendment. And then there was a central government guarantee to state governments to make them whole for up to 6 years. So you may need something similar, because if you want to replace the structure of our subsidies with, say, income transfers to farmers, then farmers have to trust you. And that trust will not happen just by passing a law. See, if you look at the protests and the farm laws, a lot of it was, people said, oh, this is political cynicism, okay, because it was in the Congress's manifesto and they opposed it when they were in opposition. And some of that is politics, okay. But there is a deeper issue. The deeper issue is trust, right? There's a deeper issue that you can't do complex reforms without building trust. And even GST, right? Like, I mean, states were nervous because the producer states were saying we're going to be worse off. And then it took a process, a 10-year process of consultations, building that thing and saying, okay, ye objection, we will deal with it. We will deal with it. We will deal with it. And that is what kind of democracy is about, right? So it's a process, but I feel that we have to do this. And, this is an example.
Amazing. So I think maybe my takeaway, from our discussion, in this episode so far is the federalism is kind of enshrined in the Constitution. We are obviously very functioning, vibrant democracy, and there is a lot of resources available state level. So almost I'll see your book as a kind of, both a invitation and challenge to different state governments. And we've seen, you got a lot of data, it's not, we talk about randomized controlled trials. If you look at, the numbers of all states and compare the best one with the worst one, all the data is there. And it's a function of choices being made at different times, policy being made, and also how progressive a particular state is or not. So I think that's, if we can shift the discourse on, just always looking at Delhi for what they are doing and just have state by state discussion, you can have much more, nuanced discussion, and probably a lot more levers are available at different state level. And they're also at different degrees of their, economic development. The per capita income, varies as much as a factor of 5 between the worst and the best. So, there's no point treating them with the, same lens, because some states have already progressed a lot. They have different level of problems, while some states needs to do a lot more welfare and a lot more, basic ground level infrastructure work. But this is great. I hope your book is on the table of every chief minister. They or, the technocrats they're working with are going to analyze data and think about what they can do in their respective states. And we'll continue this conversation in the next episode, Karthik. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
At SparX, we aim to bring to you stories of exponential impact. We share in-depth analysis of what goes behind success stories. If you find our conversations interesting, you can join us by subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to SparX on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any other audio platform of your choice. If you have any suggestions on who we should invite or what topics we need to cover, just let us know in the comments. We are always listening, looking for ways to improve, and keep getting better as we go along.